Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us. Today on Reading in the Age of Distraction, we have our program on reading to retain. My name is Patty, and I will be your host for today. Today's session is part of Reading in the Age of Distraction, a series of conversations with acclaimed local and international thinkers on the science of reading and reading well in the digital age. In this series, you'll hear from experts as they discuss the art of focused reading and learn how to become readers of words and the words around you. Now, before we start the session, here are some house rules. As this is a webinar, um, all participants are automatically muted. You're welcome to interact with other participants and our speaker for today in the chat box, as you guys have already been doing this morning. Thank you very much for that. If you have a question, you can type them into the Q&A section, the Q&A box over there in your Zoom interface. We'll try our best to answer as many questions as possible, but do note we may not be able to answer every single question due to the time constraints, but we will be seeing all your questions over there and try to address all of them. Please also note that this session is also currently being recorded. Yeah. Okay, so before we begin, let's do a quick poll, yeah, just to get everybody's sensing a little bit on note-taking. So you will have already seen a poll question pop up. So yes, we'd like to hear from you. Think about the last non-fiction book you've read and how easily were you able to recall the key points of the book? Was it easy for you? Was it difficult? Did you have to refer to the book again? Do you have to read the whole book again, or do you just flip through the little certain parts? Do you have your own notes on it that you create? Yes, we can see all the answers streaming in now. Very good, everybody. Thank you all so much for being so engaging this morning. Very nice. Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, so it seems like most of you need to flip through the book again to jog your memory. Yeah. Small percentage of you can recite the main takeaways without much effort. Very good for you. And others need some notes as well on hand, and others need to reread the book again. Okay, thank you so much for that, everybody. So today in Read to Retain, you will learn how to read actively with a pen in hand and build a habit of note-taking so that you can remember what you've read. So this brings me to our speaker for today's session. Yeah, Dr. Sönke Ahrens is a writer and researcher in the field of education and social science. He is the author of Experiment and Exploration, Forms of World Disclosure, and How to Take Smart Notes. He's currently teaching at the University of Duisburg-Essen and living in Hamburg, Germany, where he also offers coaching and counseling for a wide range of clients. So without further ado, let us have Dr. Sonke take us through today's session. Over to you, Dr. Sonke.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. It's extremely nice, first of all, to be back in Singapore. The last time I gave a presentation at the university on a completely different subject. Today, only virtual, but it's nice to be among so many fellow readers, book lovers, and I think this is the best sample of an audience you can have. I hope you can hear me well. I saw in the chats that you had a little bit of a problem earlier, so just write in the chat if you have any audible problems. Without no further ado, I think, except for the dozen of you, the 5% who has no problem with retaining the information you have read from the last book, most of us know the problem that it's actually very difficult to remember what we read and to have it available in the moment we would like to have the information. Maybe even the 5% might have trouble when it's about the last book or the book before that or the book we read last year. And what I want to suggest today is to give a little bit time to understand the advantages of taking notes, but not just taking notes, but taking notes in a particular way. If it were just taking notes, it would be maybe a too simple solution. If you don't remember it, just write it down and there you have it and off we go. And I will, in a way, also suggest that technology, even though it might be the main factor for our distractions today, and the reason why so many of us struggle to stay focused and pay attention to what we read, can also maybe the solution to get more focused and to think more thoroughly and more engagingly with what we read. And let me start with the presentation. Just a second. All right. So you should be able to see my presentation with the first slide, reading with a pen in the hand. And I would like to start what I think is the most crucial misconception about learning, and therefore about retaining information. And from there, I'm hopefully able to explain the advantages of reading with a pen in the hand and taking notes in a particular way. The most crucial misconception about learning, I believe, is that forgetting is a form of losing information. And that is actually what most research on learning was based on for the longest time. If we think that forgetting is losing information, may I just quick check, because I see in the chat that someone has problems with seeing the slide. Patty, can you just confirm that the slides are okay? No issues with the slides. Thank you. So it might be just one of the participants. Thank you. The research on science was for the longest time based on the idea that forgetting is losing information. Therefore, we have to keep information from losing. Since a few decades, this has completely shifted. And we understand today that what we fear so much, forgetting, is actually a wonderful mechanism. Because if we wouldn't be able to forget the informations we once read or encountered, we would be overwhelmed with memories in every situation. So today we start from the assumption that our brain is probably able to retain most of the information we ever encountered in some ways. And because our brain is such an enormous piece of retainer, we need a mechanism that keeps memories from popping up in the wrong moment. And that is the inhibition mechanism that works fantastically, but sometimes to our disadvantage. When we inhibit automatically information when we need it. If we keep thinking about forgetting as losing information, we think that we need to ingrain the information more deeply in our brain. And we do that by repeating the information, or we're going through something again and again. And that is what most learning methods were based on for a long time. If we, on the other hand, start with the assumption that we need to circumvent this wonderful inhibition mechanism, we start learning in a different way. And then we focus on the meaningful connections that allows our brain in the background to decide, oh, this piece of information I have here in the memory might actually fit to the one we are facing in this moment right now. So that is why we usually remember things that fit to the context. And making meaningful connections is what the technique I want to show you today is all about. Therefore, repetition is that what we thought it works. What actually works is understanding the connections between two pieces of information. And to understand the connection means we have to engage with the material more deeply. And that is what we usually call elaboration. So posing questions, thinking about the meaning of something, that is what new research on learning calls the advantageous difficulties, the things that seemingly slow down reading, but actually help us with speeding up learning for the long run. And this is where writing comes into play, because usually we think of note-taking as something that is nice to have, but rarely do we think of note-taking as something we have to take seriously. It is most often just an afterthought. And that is fitting to our early understanding about learning, that we think within our brains, and only after that we write down what we thought before. In this regard, it's literally an afterthought. Nowadays, we think of writing differently. We understand that the capacity in our short-term memory is so limited that we only are able to keep a few pieces of information in our heads at the same time. The moment we think more deeply about a topic, especially a more complex topic, we need to externalize the information so we can tinker around with it, literally with our hands, by writing it down, by putting pieces together. And if you look at complex intellectual works, when you look at how scientists work in the laboratory or with their notes as social scientists, they think as much in their writing, in their notes, with the things that are available to their hands outside of the brain as within the brain. So it's all about the division of labor between what nodes can do best, and that is objectively storing what we have written down, something our brain is not very good at because we constantly keep changing the information. We remember things we haven't experienced like that. We take two slightly different pieces of information and change the meaning so it doesn't create dissonance in our heads. And this is where the advantages of nodes come into play. Our brain, on the other hand, is great in seeing differences when they are presented to us in front of us. And it's also very good in making associations and coming up with new ideas, especially when we have something to play with, to be playful with in front of us. So this is the starting point. It's very important, I believe, to think about learning as a way to circumvent this wonderful mechanism of inhibiting information instead of something that is ingraining information in our heads, because that changes the approach to learning and to retaining what we read completely. In this way, benefits of non-linear writing for reading start with the translation of what we understand into our own words. It improves our understanding. And I say non-linear writing because in the next step, I will show you that one of the crucial ideas of the technique I want to show you is making connections between very different pieces of information instead of just keeping them within the context of where we encountered them the first time. And the first time we translate a piece of information from the context of where we encountered it into a different context is when we elaborate on it and wonder what that piece of information means for us. Not necessarily for our life, but for the questions we ponder, the interests that made us pick a particular book. And the first step, therefore, is to just jot down quickly our understanding of what we read into our own words. And using own words is actually incredibly important, because if we just copy a quote, a sentence we like very much, it starts losing the context without gaining a new one. And I think we all have made the experience when we try to explain someone else what we read in the last book, that we suddenly start to struggle a little bit, because we now need to translate it for someone else. And only by translating it into our own words, we actually realize how far our understanding goes. So it is, in this regard, the first step of note-taking, just writing a little bit of what we understand, a form of testing. And testing is seen nowadays less as a mean of control and more a mean of learning itself. Because when we read something twice, we become familiar with the context, and that might make us feel like we learned or understood the context, the content. But only if we test ourselves a little bit, putting the source to the side, trying to give account of what we read in our own words, we actually see and realize if we actually understood and retained what we read. And the good news of learning psychology is just by testing, even if we can't come up with the results, it is the part of the learning process itself. So it's not wasted time. It's actually helping us to move forward. The second bit of advantage of just writing a short note of what we read is that it forces us to focus on the gist. It's impossible to just copy the whole book. We need to break it down. We need to differentiate between what is really important and what are just explanatory details. So if you start to implement into your everyday reading life the short notes of writing down the gist of what you read, you not only test yourself on your understanding, but you also start mastering the skill of getting the gist of something. And only if you put the work into that, you have the gist available in your own words to implement it in your own life and to connect it with other pieces of information. And this is what we often not do if we just enjoy the read and then not bother about writing a short note in it. And in a way, it's also the navigation of informational overload, because what we train is cutting through all the details and getting straight to the point. And that is a skill that can be learned like other skills as well. And now the connecting bit comes into play. So the technique is based on connections. That means we take a piece of information we read somewhere and try to connect it with other pieces we wrote down before. And that means we have to think about how does this new piece of information fit to the old one. And making the connection explicit means we create a new connection that might actually be a new idea or spark a new idea, and then helps later to circumvent the aforementioned inhibition mechanism. And it is also the moment where we elaborate on the meaning of something for something that is important to us. I think this all can be summarized under elaboration, which is one of the crucial words you will find repeatedly in newer research on learning. It's always about elaborating, putting the work on deepening the understanding of what we read. And the other idea is, after you have externalized your understanding on paper and start making connections between them, it's actually a playful thing. It is not just repetitive. It is about sparking new ideas by bringing ideas that might not fit together on first sight, and thinking how they might actually fit together by creating something new. And the last bit of this note-taking advantage is that we start taking a new focus on what we read. When we anticipate that the ideas we encounter in a book will be turned into a note, and that note will be connected to other notes we have taken before, we start looking for things just automatically that might fit to what we thought before. So we are actively looking for connections, not after we read something and sit down and take a note, but note-taking and reading comes more closely enmeshed. So we start having the focus of our own notes while we read. And that means we are less reliant on the context, the question, and the frame the author is giving to us. And we are much more guided by our previous understanding of something, our own questions, and the ideas we want to follow up on. So in a way, it is also a technique of encouraging thinking for yourself. And to make things practically, I want to show you how one of the great German scientists, social scientists of the 20th century wrote his books, developed his ideas, and turned an enormous amount of reading into a similar impressive amount of books and articles. And I think we can learn from that, even if we don't replicate it directly, even if we don't read with the idea of writing books ourselves. This has become quite popular in recent years because it is, in a way, an answer to the information overload. And surprisingly, it's a very old technique. It is a technique that worked for Niklas Luhmann, the social scientist who developed this system, just by using pen and paper. And in many regards, pen and paper is a great tool because it doesn't pose distractions, it doesn't present you with notifications, but it can also be replicated with software. And there are actually quite a few apps available nowadays that are helpful and can emulate this system. So the German word Zettelkasten became nowadays, at least in some communities, as a borrowed word from German, but you can also translate it into slipbox or index files, and you will recognize these from the old parts of a library where things were stored on little index cards. And as you can see, he wrote his notes on little pieces of paper, just in the format of A6. That's a quarter of a normal sheet of paper. And he didn't use these cardboard cards because they were too thick for him. He realized he can store much more information and many more sheets of paper if he just uses normal paper. And he also wrote only on one side, so he doesn't have to take them out all the time and can quickly glance through them. And the main idea is that all the notes are not categorized, are not put into folders, so they are also not compartmentalized to each other, for example, by disciplines, by topics, or something else. Everything goes into one place and has the chance to come in contact with other ideas. There are actually two boxes he used. One is filled with literature notes, and the other is filled with the translations of the ideas into his own thinking context, which I call permanent notes because they are meant to be stored permanently and forever. Let's have a quick look at a typical literature note. As you can see, they are very brief. So he doesn't spend much time on elaborating on the ideas on this note. He just writes on page 22, there is something about this and that. And page 27, there is something about something else. And on the back side, you have the source. So that's very basic. And his daily routine was to read stuff during the day in the university and write these literature notes. And in the evening, he would think about what these pieces of information mean for his own questions, his own work, how they fit into what he has written before. And that is where all the things come into play I mentioned before. And as he didn't have a category system, he would just start with one note and give it a little number on the top left, and he would start with number 1. And the next one would be number 2, and so on. But after a while, you see that he might want to add an idea because it fits very well, for example, to note number 9.8. But there is also already a note number 9.9, and there's also a note number 9.8a. But he would just put the new note in between the old ones, and by branching them out, he could build a new note sequence. So as you can see, there is a previous note sequence, and he can branch them out whenever needed. What might seem confusing and complex at first sight is actually pretty simple by just altering between numbers and letters with a slash or a comma in between. And this is something we don't really need to do anymore with the help of the technology we have. But it is the basic idea of it. So branching out and building note sequences is the key to understand Niklas Luhmann's note-taking system, the Zettelkasten. And as you can see, the main idea is that every new piece of information is connected, ideally, to one that previously existed. So he would expand on ideas continuously, and confront a new piece of information he took from a book and think, elaborate on the connection. So writing a new note also means to make explicit how one piece of information is related to another one. And that sometimes means just adding it. Sometimes it means discovering that it contradicts what we previously thought, something we rarely discover in our own heads. We often have trouble to see contradictions between what we thought before and our a new idea. But if we force ourselves to give an account on the connection of something we have written before and something we are about to write, then it's much easier to make these contradictions, differences explicit and quite visual. So that is the basic idea. The same sequence you have visualized here would look within this slipbox system just like this. And you also see that sometimes some nodes that were previously together are interrupted now by many nodes. That is a disadvantage that at the same time is an advantage, because now in a way chance comes into play, and sometimes two nodes are nearby that we haven't thought about might be a good fit. So leaving chance is also part of Luhmann's system. Yes, and I showed you some notes just to give you a visual impression. With technology, it might look very different, but the principles are often the same. Now you might wonder that it certainly becomes very complex over time, and we might lose an overview. And that is certainly true. But giving ourselves an overview is in a way just another thought in itself, and therefore can be written down on a note. He would also keep an index, and this is the last bit of information you need to understand the system, which is just an alphabetically sorted index that hints you, that gives you a direction to an entry note into a particular question, topic, line of thought. So he wouldn't write down all the notes that are relevant for that topic. It just points to one note from where he could go further. And also you will sometimes find, just like links in the internet, points to other nodes somewhere else in the system, just like hyperlinks today. Okay, I'll just have a quick look if I missed something important in the comments. One of you pointed out that in a way it's not thinking outside the box, it's actually encouragement to think inside the box. That is certainly true, but it's also misleading, because it is a way of sparking creativity. And what seems at first sight as heavily standardized way of treating all information the same. Every piece of information, regardless of where it comes from, ends up on the same little piece of note. But we know from the research on creativity, restrictions, limitations, standardizations can sometimes actually spark creativity. That is why poetry is so rich, because it has limitations and certain standards on how to write. This is why the canvas, which gives us a limitation in space, is not restricting the creativity of painters. So in a way, there is a connection between standardization and creativity. And maybe as the last most powerful example, how these two seemingly unfitting things go together. Our language consists of a limited number of letters, and all the things we can do with these few letters is truly amazing. And we certainly wouldn't improve language just by adding more to the alphabet. Okay, and of course, I cannot give you a complete description of this system, but I hope you got a clear idea how this way of taking notes and putting them all together in one place, adding new notes to existing ones and expanding on ideas, is different to the way most of us learned note-taking in school. And I want to finish up by just comparing what I would call the traditional, the linear system of writing with this non-linear way of expanding notes just in one place. Usually when we take notes for a particular reason, a particular project. We might have a presentation at work, we'll read things for that particular project and collect everything that is interesting for that particular project in one folder. The problem is that after the project is finished, we often don't really have a place to put these notes. We sometimes archive them. We put it in a bigger binder and maybe write down projects 2020 or projects for work instead of projects for ourselves. But it keeps the ideas compartmentalized. And the only way to get back to what we thought about it is to remember that we encounter the piece of information during this particular project. So it's still pretty much reliant on our brain. Luhmann's system, on the other hand, works slightly different, as everything is put into one place and meant to be stored forever, always available to be expanded upon later on. No piece of information is ever lost outside the system and can present itself when we look for new possible connections. So now we at least have the chance to encounter something we already forgot completely. We wouldn't even think about looking for it. And I have to admit, this is an experience I have very often, that I want to add a piece of information I read somewhere and look for where I might add it to, and discover I already wrote that idea down. Slightly different most often, but it wasn't as new as I believed. And sometimes I think I have a great idea, I write it down, look for a possible connection, and discover I already had that idea before. And it wasn't even my idea, because I wrote down on the note that I took it from a book I read a few years ago. In a way, I'm happy that the system reminds me of that instead of colleagues at a conference, but it makes it obvious to myself that externalizing my memory is a necessity because of the limited capacities I have in my head. And therefore, we also focus not on where we encountered an idea, but where we want to be reminded of. So writing something down, thinking about where might it add to, is a little bit like leaving the keys in front of your door, because when we leave the door, we will stumble upon it when we need it, instead of having to remember where we put it. And this only works in note-taking by standardization. What is most often the case is that we start intuitively to take notes where we encounter them. That means we highlight sentences in the books we read, we make comments in the margins, and then we have our different folders. And when we read something on the internet, we might tag it, write a little note there. When we have something during the day, we might carry around a journal. So we end up with lots of different medias, and that makes it very difficult to put things together, which leads to compartmentalization and inhibits network building. The intuitive way of note-taking, just writing down whenever we encounter something and then think about where we put it, or put everything in a journal, is easy. It's not something we have to spend much time thinking about. But it becomes very complicated after a while, because there is no overarching idea that holds it all together. The standardization of notes allows complexity to build up, and is, once you get the idea and get into a little bit of a routine, is actually a pretty simple system in itself. And what I mentioned earlier in the beginning about our new insight into how learning works, it is actually a system that forces us by chance, I would say, to do exactly what the research suggests we should do if we want to retain the information we read. As we have to write down briefly what the gist of something is and how it relates to other pieces of information, how we understand it, translate it in our own words. It is a form of forced elaboration done every day, instead of, sorry, writing something down in the context and maybe also in the order we encountered it. When we take excerpts, for example, from a book, we keep it in the original context and we end up going through it in the same order again and again. That means we read it again and again. And this is the technique of review that research has shown doesn't work very well. So it's not a top-down approach, as we don't start with fixed categories and then put information into these categories or folders, but ideas, clusters of information and categories can build up bottom up. We don't have to know today what will be we always come back to and think about more thoroughly. We can just look where notes have built up, and that is probably the topic that attracted our interest again and again. And for those of you who write, this is very important because we usually start with writing projects by an idea and then do the research. If you wrote notes all along the way, then you can just look where you have already the most information. And if you then make the decision to write about that, you already have the material and don't have to rely on guesswork, where good information literature might be. I think it's obvious that this is not a linear approach, but a circular approach. We come back to the same information again, connected differently. So it helps with keeping old memories fresh and not just focusing on the newest shiny thing, but appreciating also older thoughts that might still have value. And this is also an approach that you become better over time. You become an expert in note-taking just by practicing it every day a little bit. And Luhmann, who was extremely successful, actually took just 6 notes a day. And even if you take only 3 notes a day, which is quite doable, you will end up with an enormous treasure of ideas and thoughts that become more valuable over time. And it's not a system that teaches you to follow rules, because just following rules doesn't make you an expert. It only turns you into someone who can plan. But when it comes to insight and new ideas, creativity, we can't really plan. How do you plan for insight? It is something unexpected. And the last bit, technology is here just as writing, not an afterthought. It is not something that it relies on the brain. It's more that the brain can decentralize within the network of ideas and focus on connections and be playful with it. That's why I call it decentralization. And therefore also there is a different division of labor between the technology and the writing and our brain. We know some things our brains are great in, other things not so much. But it's not a hierarchy in the sense of everything is controlled by our brain. We don't have to remember everything. When we have a system in place that gives us hints where to look for, and sometimes presents us with ideas long forgotten. And this is the book I've written about the subject and the reason I was invited today. And I think we're now ready on time to go to the Q&A session, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Paddy, would you take over from here, please?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sonke, for breaking down your entire method and how it came to be. It was all very insightful. And of course, everybody who is tuning in today, if you would like to find out more, you can read Dr. Sonke's book, which we will link to you at the end of today's session. Okay, so we got some questions here that we've taken from the comments as well as the Q&A box. Someone is asking about mind mapping to remember what you read. Would you have any thoughts about this, Dr. Sonke?
Yes, I think mind mapping is a great tool that helps us to clarify. It is limited, and it is always important with technology to know its limitations. Mind mapping can only work with what is on our mind, and therefore it's great to start a project, but it's not a good tool for permanent notes. So I suggest to combine mind mapping with note browsing, that you look for notes you might have long forgotten first, and then make a map out of them. So you expand your universe of ideas quite a bit with that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, there's another question on the difference between taking notes digitally or physically, and whether that helps or there's a difference in making meaningful connections that way.
Yeah, I'm sure it's has a lot to do with personal preferences. There is a bit of interesting research, though, when it comes to lecture notes. So the researchers divided students into two groups. One group wrote only by hand, only pen and paper were allowed, and another group, they only had their computers and typed on the keyboard. And the first interesting outcome is that the people who typed were able to type in much more information. So they had more information available. And those who take notes by hand were slower and therefore had less information on paper. But asked after a week what the gist of the lecture was, those who wrote by hand were much better in remembering the gist of it. And that is probably what I mentioned in the beginning. When we are very fast in typing, we don't focus on the gist of something, but we almost verbatim copy what we hear. And when we have limited time and space, when we know that we can't copy everything we hear, we force ourselves to focus on the gist of something. So we have to translate it into our own words, otherwise we wouldn't be able to compress the information. So it's a disadvantage that turns out to be an advantage when it comes to retaining information. And therefore, I would suggest, even if you take notes digitally, I see no problem with that. just pretend you have limited space and you have to treat it as if you have only the screen available and cannot scroll down. That would be my suggestion, to have the best of two worlds.
Ah, okay. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Actually, there's a question linked to this question. And that's if you're taking notes digitally, are there any software or apps out there that help in taking notes and providing this sort of like limited context for you to take your notes in?
There are now apps available that are directly emulating the Zettelkasten of Niklas Luhmann, Zettler, for example, or ZKN3, but I would recommend one of two apps that seem to have the most momentum at the moment, and that is Obsidian and Roam. I just write these names down in the chat. And Obsidian, someone already used it, has also a very lively community around it. So I suggest just to look it up, engage a little bit with the people, and they are so lovely, helpful, and point you to sources, how to get started. So I think I would recommend Obsidian nowadays, probably, but also it's a bit of the question of personal taste.
Right.
I use Roam Research and I like it a lot, and I see no reason to switch, but Obsidian is maybe the one with more momentum at the moment. But I see there are or Logsac, I haven't mentioned that. So there are a lot of experts in the chat. I see you already are in the middle of these communities.
Brilliant, brilliant. Right. So it's all down to what works for you and sort of trying all these things out and seeing what works best for you.
Yes, I would recommend to go with one that has bi-directional linking. That means it's decentralized in it's not hierarchical in its setup. So something like Evernote, for example, or Notion doesn't work very well because it forces you to compartmentalize. So there's a lot of available, but I wouldn't necessarily go with the traditional old-fashioned apps.
Right, right. Okay. Well, actually, on the topic of compartmentalization, then there are a couple of questions regarding this. There's a question asking if you would suggest having non-linear notes for two disparate categories, for example, maths versus literature, but keep it combined for related topics, for example, history and economics.
This is an example where it's probably difficult to see many connections between it. But I also see no reason to have two different systems. From my own experience, I don't do math, but I work quite interdisciplinary. And if there are no natural connections, it can still exist within the same system. And whenever you feel you need to give yourself an overview, just write another note and give yourself an overview with links to the related notes. And keeping it in the same system, it gives you the option to see if there might be a connection. And actually, now that I think about it, a friend of mine just wrote a very interesting thesis on the origins of mathematics and Greek philosophy. So there were suddenly a lot of interesting combinations, and he wouldn't have seen them if he had them in two different places.
Yeah, I agree. I like to think that there's all original thoughts that we've had always link from something before that we've seen.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of keeping options open to have links there.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a follow-up question on linking as well. Would you encourage linking by ideas or notes more than linking by categories or tags?
Yes, I would always encourage to link as explicitly on the content level as possible. So instead of just tagging, elaborate on what the connection is. So not just thinking, oh, that might relate to, but write explicitly, this contradicts the findings of, or this is an additional example for, or here these two authors use the same word, but mean something different. And only by making that explicit and spending a moment of writing that down, you really engage with the content. There is a huge risk with tagging in the internet, because it's so easy to do that we just have the association thing, oh, that might fit to that. But if we leave it by that, we haven't made progress. It's the association is great as a hint that there might be something, but making that explicit is the crucial step. I would say that is where thinking starts, where we have to hesitate a little bit and wonder how. Yeah.
I see. Okay. So in relation to that for example, there's a follow-up question here on when you start doing all these things. Someone asks, when should I start to take the notes? While I'm reading the text or the book, or do I take note by pages or chapter, or after I've read the entire book or text?
Also, great question. This is why I put expert on the slide, because if I gave you a rule, I could only teach you to become someone who follows a plan. But being an expert means deciding for yourself when it makes most sense. And that depends again on the content. So I have shorter articles on topics I'm well familiar with. I would immediately take notes while I'm reading. Then I have topics I'm not that familiar with. Then I usually spend some time reading it first to understand, okay, where does it lead to? I don't have the categories in my head. I need to learn the kind of argument, and would then afterwards go back and see where I scribbled something into the text, and only then take a literature note. And sometimes there's a book where I actually just enjoy reading it and don't want to interrupt the flow of it, and would therefore postpone the note taking to whenever I'm starting to think more about it. And that is sometimes after a chapter, sometimes after two chapters. So I think it's also important to kind of listen to yourself when it makes most sense. But don't just leave it and then not take notes, because that's often then yeah, just the impression of having retained something, and yeah. But when we are familiar with a topic, there's no reason not to immediately write something down.
I see. Okay. So yeah, it's a matter of whether you have the context, you're familiar with the context of what you're reading already. And if you don't have that, it's familiarizing yourself in that context.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So when you're really familiar with something and you read an article, you immediately also see, okay, I know everything of that. Where's a new piece of information? And then you don't even take a literature note because there's only one piece of information. You can directly write into a permanent note, hint back to the original source. But when I'm new to a topic, I feel like, oh, there's so much new. This I didn't know. This I didn't know. I need to write this all down. So also notes become shorter the more of an expert you are in a field.
Ah, okay. So that's what you were speaking about just now. There's a question related to this. You were basically like doing your own identification of key terms, so to speak, in your note-taking system, right? So what role does this play, this identification of key terms in your note-taking system? And how do you identify it? Do you have any criteria for it?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand it correctly, but there are, of course, concepts in my head I apply to reading, but also I'm looking for key concepts within a text. And this is also often a good way of connecting notes. Something is talking about the importance of elaboration. So that might be something different people speak about, and then you can see, okay, how do they speak about elaboration in different terms, or enlightenment, or something like that. So they are like road maps, or like signposts, I would say. Yeah, but this goes a little bit into the academic world, I think, that concepts, theories, schools of thought become very important in categorizing. I think for everyday reading, like I do when I'm not that familiar with a topic, questions are more important to sort things. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Understood. Speaking of concepts, actually, there's a question here asking, is there a difference in effectiveness when recalling concepts and testing ourselves with real life problems, or made up scenarios, sort of like hypothetical situations?
Can you repeat the beginning of it?
Is there a difference in effectiveness when recalling concepts
Right,
and testing ourselves with real life problems or made up
right.
scenarios?
Interesting. I cannot answer the question because I don't have the data available. But what I can tell you is that principles are extremely difficult to forget. So something that is well understood as, for example, the principle of gravitation or pressure, that once we understand that, we just have difficulty to forget that again. That also means that the moment we have a certain principle in abstract terms in our head, it becomes very difficult to replace it with something better. While everyday practical examples are much more easily to replace. So that might be the reason some academics are so can't change their minds very well. But the original question, I would have to look that up.
Sure. Okay. Now we have some questions specific to different groups of our participants. I think we have a parent here asking if there's a right age to introduce children to make notes while reading.
I think simple notes, translating something into your own words, that you can start with that when you, as a practice of writing and reading. But I probably wouldn't build up a note-taking system like Lumen that early. I do get some feedback from teachers in schools, start as early as 12 years, so probably after elementary school. But I always implore parents, it should be playful. It shouldn't be something that feels like a chore. So as long as it's a playful thing, I think it's great to tinker around with it, leave it, set it up new, but don't make it feel like you're putting something on top of reading that feels like it must be done, because I think the best thing you can teach in an early age is just loving to read, and nothing should distract from that.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I like that. It's true. I can imagine, like, as a parent, like, we are more concerned about, making sure our kids retain the information, but at a young age, it's the love of reading that should be the focus, right? To sort of build that habit first.
Yeah, and so I'm very grateful that my parents left me alone with, and so it was always okay to read. That wasn't always acceptable pastime, and I'm really glad they didn't interfere and turned it into a task. Yeah.
That's brilliant. I like that. Okay, we have a question from a medical student. They say, hi, Dr. Sönke. I'm a medical student. The amount of content we have to learn is enormous. In such cases, I can imagine Zettelkasten-like systems becoming quite cumbersome and difficult to use effectively. For example, the note for fever may have thousands of related notes. What are your thoughts on note-taking for medical students?
I hesitate to answer that with confidence, because I know that also being on top of the information is extremely important, and this system keeps also old notes in the system, and they pop up after a while that might not be extremely helpful. I envisioned something that's in between. I get a lot of questions from medical doctors, and if I have a little bit more time, I will speak with some to maybe develop a system especially designed for the medical profession, because the need is really pressing there. There was a time where IBM promised to solve the problem with AI, and this didn't work out very well. but I see that even high-level doctors use their own improvised systems most of the time. So it would be a great endeavor to develop something that for that field especially. But I wouldn't say you can just implement it in the Zettelkasten.
Okay. That's actually very interesting. Yeah, and I can imagine as being a med student, it's really a tough task to to study and take notes and of all the content that they have to study. Okay, we've got another question here, asking about verbalizing notes instead of writing. Does it work? Is it more effective, or is that something you do or hurt people doing while using the smart note system?
So like taking audio records of it?
Um, I'm interpreting verbalizing as in reading it aloud while I'm writing. Like for example, sometimes when I try to retain information, I would say it out too. Like let's say if it's a phone number, or a note or a word while I'm doing my work, I will say it out so that I can hear myself saying it. But when it comes to note taking,
Yeah.
yeah, is this better as well? Does it make it more effective in some cases?
Also interesting. I haven't really thought about that, and I'm not sure if there is research on. There is certainly research on that. From my own experience, it's I struggle sometimes explaining things I just recently read to someone else, but feel it's really effective in discovering my lack of understanding. um, and I see note taking as like the little sister of it, because I explain it to myself,
Hmm.
but I feel explaining it to someone else verbally is even more effective, just in discovering the gaps in my understanding, because I look at it from a different viewpoint.
Hmm.
On the other hand, it doesn't replace writing it down, because then you cannot store it properly. But teaching is always seen as and verbal teaching, the best way to understand something for yourself. And that is my experience as well.
I experienced that too. So to the person who asked this question, I found what was effective, and especially when I was studying with my friends, when we did like a group studies, we would explain things to each other or have each other teach things to each other, and in turn we're helping ourselves internalize the information. So I find that to be very
Yeah,
effective. Well, yeah.
you need good friends and patient
Yes.
families.
Step one, find friends. Yes. Okay. Okay, I think we are running a little short on time, so I think we'll take one last question. We have a question here specific to your book. So Dr. Sönke, in the book, section 9.4, okay, this one's very specific here. What does it mean when you say real experts don't make plans?
Yeah, that I mentioned that on the slide. So it's taken out of context. Of course, plans do have their place and their importance, but we often teach writing and note taking, even in higher education, as a step-by-step process that needs to be followed. Even reading sometimes is taught like step one, step two, step three, make a plan. And then you have the problem with insight. So if you conduct research, you cannot plan for the outcome, because the outcome will come in the end. That's the whole point of it. So you have to have a different approach than if you have a business plan at hand. And I think it's in the section where I compare it with GTD, Getting Things Done from David Allen, which is all about setting up a system and start with the goal. And I think it's a great system. It's very similar in many regards, but you have to know where you're going. And if you conduct research or an open-ended learning project, you just don't know where you will end up to. So you need a different system. But that doesn't mean everything is up to chance and you can just wander around. And that's where the expert comes into play. And the expert is someone who draws a lot from experience and knows in which direction it might be fruitful to go, and knows from experience, notice certain patterns of well, this might not lead to a good outcome. So being an expert means knowing how to navigate on site. If that's helpful. But I think most importantly is, let's not teach writing research, open-ended processes as if you can follow a step-by-step process, when actually sometimes you need to write something down to understand it, then you need to go back to research, then you need to write a little bit more, and then you realize there's a gap in the argument, so you have to look at your notes again. So it's much more back and forth and not a step-by-step.
Right. So it's about, embracing the uncertainty and trusting in the process that you'll get there eventually.
Exactly. Like Vivian says in the chat, it's an iterative process.
Yes. Okay. I think that's all the questions we'll take for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Sönke, for teaching us how we can take and organize our notes so that we can remember what we read and access them even when we are done with a book. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Sönke, for your sharing. And thank you for coming on board as one of our speakers. I think we'll come to the end of this morning's session. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your Saturday morning with us. Thank you, Dr. Sönke, for your especially early morning with us with the time difference.
Thank you very much.
Germany. Yes.
Of
course, it's a pleasure. Great pleasure.
Thank you for the invitation, and Ilyani, Patty, and Saranya for organizing it. You were great hosts, and it's such a pleasure with this kind of audience. I will look through the chats, and I will certainly discover more interesting questions to ponder. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yes, thank you everybody for coming. Reading in the Age of Distraction will be taking place at the next time slot this coming Saturday. Our final session, Read to See, will be taking place at 10 a.m. and we will explore how we can hone our visual perception skills through art to better read people, places, and situations. So yes, do look out for that program on our Eventbrite platform. Thank you everybody. Have a good weekend, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.